Algebra 2, Unit 10. Let's look at Core 2, Statistical Study, the Basic Steps, and let's explore sample methods. So in Core 1, Concepts 46 and 47, you were introduced to ways to explore data, identifying a group of interest, a population, and ways to study those groups through representative subgroups, samples, can lead to conclusions about a sample or a population. Analyzing the characteristics of a data set to find the mean, standard deviation, and the data dispersions, like normal distribution curve or skewed data sets, allows an exploration of the data set. In Core 2, which is Concepts 48, 49, and 50, you will continue learning the basic steps of a statistical study and walk through the steps of a hypothetical study during the teacher talks for each of these concepts. First, you will identify what you want to study, and you're going to pose that in the form of an overarching question. Then you will identify the population to study, although sometimes that is tied up with the overarching question. Decide how you will choose a good representative sample of your population. Use a form of random sampling to decrease bias in your sample and encourage accurate results and conclusions in your study if possible. Then, decide on how you will collect the data. Design your experiment. Is a survey best, a simulation, an observational study, or a controlled experiment? Finally, you will draw inferences about the population that you are studying. So here are the formal steps of a statistical study. Number 1, identify your overarching question to be studied. Number 2, identify your population, then choose a sampling method and try to design one that will avoid bias. Number 3, design the experiment. How will you collect data? A survey, a simulation, observation, an experiment, and then finally, draw inferences and conclusions. During each teacher talk of the last 3 concepts, you will design a hypothetical research study and discuss it with your teacher. Your population should be the students at Liberty North High School. Perhaps you have something in mind that you would like to know about the students of LNHS. Look at the list of overarching questions below to help you start thinking about a potential question for you to use. You may use one of the questions listed, or you may pose one of your own. So let's go through these possible questions. How do LNHS students communicate in the era of technology? How do LNHS students perceive the overall social and learning climate of the school? How much do students feel that they are valued members of the school community? How attentive and invested are students in their classes? How safe do students feel physically and psychologically at school? Do students involved in extracurricular activities do better academically than those who aren't involved? How does giving each student a laptop affect their studies? How do students feel about diversity, equity, and inclusion? Which learning mode or modes are most successful for students? How do students see teacher-student relationships at LNHS? How do students perceive masking has affected the learning environment? How well are students able to regulate their own emotions? All right, so now these are just possible questions. We need you to take some time to think about your question, and then you want to write your hypothetical research question in the space below. Again, if any of the ones that I mentioned, these are just some sample questions, caught your interest, you could use that one. If not, just take some time to think about. If you're unsure, you have an idea, but are not quite sure how to word it, just talk it over with one of your teachers. Then be sure to write your question in the space below. Now let's get into the concept of sample methods. So in this concept, we're going to focus on taking a closer look at where data comes from for studies. This will involve looking at different sampling methods, design of experiments, and the importance of randomization in our analysis. So remember, the population in a statistical study is the entire group of individuals that we want information about. A sample is a subset of individuals in the population from which we collect data. So, random samples. A simple random sample. This is when a sample of n, just a number of subjects, is selected so that every member of the population has the same chance of being chosen. This is the best way to sample well. A stratified sample. This is when a sample is divided into subgroups. And then a sample is selected randomly from each group. This is also a good way to sample well. A cluster sample. This is when a population is divided into clusters, and then a sample of clusters is selected, choosing all of the members in the cluster or clusters. This is a fair way to sample, not the best way. Remember, the best way is when all members of the population have an equal chance of being chosen for the sample group. A systematic sample, this is when a starting point is chosen in a population, and then every, let's say, third or fifth, we'll just say K to stand in for a member is chosen. So you could arrange in alphabetical order and choose every fifth member. This often does produce a biased sample. That means a sample where one part of the population is under or overrepresented. Convenient sample. This is when members of the population are selected that are easy to reach. So if someone is just standing in a place asking for surveys, often this does produce a biased sample because not everyone in the population being studied has an equal chance of being a part of the sample. A self-selected sample, this is when members of the population volunteer to be a part of the sample. So you're sent an email and asked to respond to a survey. That is a self-selected sample. If you respond, you are part of it, and if you don't, you are not. And this also often produces a biased sample. That's where some members of the population are over or underrepresented. Now, sampling bias is when a sample is created in a way, and I've said this, but we'll say it again, when some members of the population are underrepresented or overrepresented than others. Another type of bias is there could be an issue with non-response. So maybe the question is kind of a hot topic and people don't want to respond to it. And because those chosen for the sample, they may not be contacted or they just refuse. There is also response bias. So again, this is if someone would want to respond a particular way to a question to appear a particular way. Let's go through some examples. So using the definition above, see if you can identify the type of sample that was created. The population to be studied is your math class. So we will assign every student in the class a number and then use a random number generator to select numbers and create a sample. So a random number generator produces a sample where every member of the population has an equal chance of being chosen. So this is a simple random sample method. Number 2, choose every third student as they enter the classroom to be a part of the sample. We could think of that as convenient, but since we're making a rule of every third, we could call that a systematic sample. Choose the number 3, we're going to choose the 2 tables of students that are closest to the front of the room to be a part of the sample. That will be a convenience sample because they are closest. Number 4, group the class by grade level and then randomly select students from each grade level to be a part of the sample. So notice first we're grouping, so this will be a stratified study, and then randomly selecting, so this will be a stratified random sampling, which is nearly as good as a simple random sample to give all members of the population an equal chance of being chosen. Number 5, group students by grade level and then randomly choose one grade level to be the sample. So we are creating a cluster sample because we are grouping by grade level and then taking that whole cluster. Number 6, at the beginning of class, students were asked to come to the front of the room if they wish to be a part of the sample group. So this would be self-selected because the students are volunteering. These are all identified ways to create sample groups to study a population, but again, not all Some are better than others. So the simple random sample is best, stratified random is good, and then the others could definitely produce a biased sample group. Now look at those above and identify two of the sample methods that would have a sampling bias because portions of the population are under or overrepresented. So take a minute and just select two of them and then pause the video and then come back and we'll discuss. All right, welcome back. So the ones that I see that would definitely have a sampling bias would be if it was self-selected, people were volunteering because not everyone has an equal chance. A second one would be convenience. Sometimes that is an easy way to create a sample and thus do a study, but again, it will most likely over or underrepresent a part of the population. The systematic sample, that's better than a convenience or self-selected, but again, can produce bias. So that concludes the first part of the concept where we're studying sample methods. And so in part 2, we're going to look specifically, on how to sample well.